And so one might have more frequent elections, more campaigning. And I think that'll add an element of great chaos and I think possible frustration for the electorate.
South Africa is primed for political realignment, but how might this play out? Well, joining me on the podcast is Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, a writer at the Daily Friend. Jonathan, welcome to the show. South Africa's economy is flatlining. We're not seeing the growth levels that are needed. We've had this prolonged lockdown as well as this energy crisis, which has really crippled the economy. The need for reform couldn't be greater, but are we seeing the reforms that are necessary coming out of the current administration?
Well, we're seeing few reforms, but focused on energy, of course, because of the nature of circumstances, really, that are forcing reforms. They're forcing them to allow the private sector to play a far greater role. It doesn't go far enough, but it is a start. And the extent to which it'll, in fact, solve the problem, i.e. alleviate power cuts, has yet to be seen, because more coal-powered stations will go offline as they naturally age and require greater maintenance. But one is really seeing little reform in other areas, in the public enterprises. They've managed to I suppose, publicly save a bit of pride by saving SAA and putting it half in public hands, but in fact subsidizing it, but it doesn't really go far enough. They're not prepared to let anything go, because if they do sell a public enterprise at fire sale prices, they get mud on their faces for messing it up. So Denel is in crisis, the SABC is in crisis, and one could go through the list. So the scope of reform has to be very large. One has, in energy, one has to allow, I think, the private sector to come in and on contract maintain those coal-powered stations forever, how long is required. And the private sector should be allowed to build anything, a power station of any size, really, if we're going to solve this problem. They've adopted a sort of piecemeal approach, saying private sector come in, but don't do too much. Well, if you want an energy sector that operates properly, like much of the rest of the world, and there's very low risk of power cuts, I think that's what you've really got to do. So it's very piecemeal what they're doing, and they still face some big issues, particularly on the public enterprises, which they're not continuing to subsidize, yet they're sort of collapsing, like Denel. At certain stages, Denel has been unable to meet payroll, and that's a real crisis, and they're not meeting contracts. And our economy is losing as a result of that. So, just get on and privatize it. What's the problem here? Yes, there will be job losses, but in this, as these enterprises go into a crisis, there'd arguably be more job losses. Education, it's a whole, education has to be reformed. Our education sector is lagging. Healthcare, I think the public sector healthcare system is very poor. There are pockets of excellence. Those have to be reformed. The police have to be reformed. So it's really a very wide-scale reforms that have to be undertaken to put the economy into the 21st century and allow it to compete. But there are political costs, of course. There are going to be job losses, and how the ANC handles the politics of all this, it will be very difficult. At the moment, it's just stalled. They're not prepared to make the sort of key decisions that are required. And Eskom, of course, is the test bed of these reforms. It is so large, it carries so much state debt, which has to be taken off Eskom's books and be put on the state's books, which is yet another burden.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just on the privatization question. I mean, I think we actually have a model of success in telecom that was liberalized. It was able to compete in the open market. It still has some state involvement, but I think that is a success story. But I think this speaks to the ideological convictions of the party. They have a tendency towards centralization, command and control. They see these state assets as strategic assets. And obviously there is a corruption element to that as well. These are important sources of patronage for the party, and patronage is really what holds the party together as well. But all of this means that they're not really addressing the fundamental underlying problems that are constraining South Africa's economy. There's also massive governance problems. Municipalities are collapsing. The basic administration of the state is just nowhere near where it should be. And all of that is potentially a political headwind for the ANC. How do you think they are faring in terms of their run-up to 2024?
Well, in politics, 2 years is a long time, but there have been these recent polls, and the ANC has, in two of them, the ANC has done particularly badly. In the local government elections last year, it got nearly 48% of the vote, which is, in one sense, is very poor because they came under. It showed immense dissatisfaction, low percentage poll, plus they didn't get a majority, these local government polls in aggregate. And last week, Report leaked a poll showing ANC support running at 38%, and Ipsos, the market research organization, showed it at 42%. But these might be a bit of an aberration, and the results of polling methods and so forth. We don't know much about the origins of the poll that was leaked to Report, but it showed the sort of decline in ANC support that would only occur in urban areas. And the DA in the Report poll went to 27%, with ANC support hemorrhaging to the DA, which really has not happened. The Ipsos poll, by contrast, has the DA running at 11%. But that's all a bit unlikely. We're 2 years before, and I don't think we should look for a sudden and catastrophic for the ANC, catastrophic decline in its support. I think it's more credible to see polls that showed more gradual. So the Social Research Foundation, which is of which Frans Cronje, the former Institute of Race Relations CEO, is a director, only sees the ANC at 52% on a 56% poll. So it's up from the 2021 elections. Look, it's a long way to go. And of course, other political parties might come into the field ahead of the elections. We don't know how Action SA will perform. It's not done great, but it's running at 6% in the SRF poll. That's not a great showing, even at that stage, because it's been around for quite a few years, and it's not very strong outside Gauteng. Nevertheless, that could gain some traction. The DA in the SRF poll is up to 25% from about 20%. So they could enjoy somewhat of a recovery. And the EFF polls in all these polls around about 9 to 11%. So it might well be the 10. It might well have a cap of 10%. Other parties might come into the field. There's Operation Dudula, the anti-immigrant group, could gain traction. But would this be at the expense of the ANC, or would this be at the expense of perhaps the EFF? because both organizations attract the youth. And then there's the possibility of other center-right parties, parties to the right of the ANC emerging. France Cronje says that if one could have a couple of parties that are emerge that are to the right of the ANC. So there's a lot that is on the go. Politics are changing. There's dissatisfaction with the ANC. Another question, of course, ahead of the elections is, will the ANC voters, people who voted in the ANC and still feel their heartstrings are tugged by the Party of Liberation, will they move to other parties? So there are a lot of questions, but there's also a lot of time between now and the elections. So, I don't think the ANC decline will be as fast and furious as some expect, but I think we've seen peak ANC, and politics will now have to adjust around that.
So, Jonathan, I think a large part of the ANC's electoral success will depend on perceptions of the president. And in a lot of the polling and analysis that we've done, we've seen that the popularity of the president tends to outpace the popularity of the party that he leads. I think through very skillful public relations, he's been able to kind of separate himself, almost keep himself at arm's length from the party. But, anything could happen in terms of his reputation. And I think his reputation has been sullied by this Phala affair. It looks like he's going to maintain his status as the president of the ANC at the end of the year. But what do you think about public perceptions towards the president?
Ramaphosa brought the ANC a good margin of victory in 2019, and he's popular. And yes, he does have a number of questions to answer for after Phala, and it'll depend on how he plays that. But the ANC, Ramaphosa is popular, but they've also got to come up with a recovery plan. And I think that's what they're doing. They're trying to address the Eskom problem, which is a big, big problem for them. Not having power cuts show the ANC is not in charge of the country. The ANC runs the government, and the government runs Eskom and their power cuts. That shows a degree of chaos, a degree of lack of control, and I think it would be the worst thing for power cuts, extensive power cuts, to occur just ahead of the 2024 poll. So they are trying all they can to avoid that. But they're also speaking of increased grants. There's talk of a wealth tax in the ANC to fund a basic income grant. There's talk of national health insurance. There's a greater urgency over expropriation without compensation. So these are all attempts to mobilize the voters in 2024 so they can answer the question, what have you done for us, with greater clarity. I don't think any of their policies will address the key really big issues, which are, of course, jobs and unemployment on the one hand, and service delivery. They just seem incompetent at doing both. And to achieve these goals, they'd have to have, as we discussed earlier, reform. And they will stall on, I don't see reform of the labor markets coming to allow freer labor markets and people to work at wages that are below the rates negotiated by these bargaining councils, which effectively fix the price of labor.
Yeah, and I think a lot of those populist impulses are also going to be quite considerable within the party. And, this desperate attempt to try and shore up votes, particularly amongst kind of the rural poor constituencies, this extension of the the COVID relief grants, I think, is also another example of that, trying to make those permanent. But now,
well, on that, they've got to decide what to do, because the COVID relief grant is coming to an end at the end of the fiscal year, at the end of February next year, and they've got to decide what will it be replaced with. So I don't think they can't in that sort of time frame. They can't suddenly come in with a basic income grant, because it would be it's just too big a project, in the sense that you've got to consider then cancelling all other grants and just having the basic income grant. So, they've got to design the new system, and that I think will take a long time.
All right. So just in terms of the potential coalition dynamics, so we touched a little bit on the state of the opposition, but now this fragmentation, I think, is going to throw up a lot of potential scenarios. So, I mean, the one scenario that we've been talking about a lot on our various channels and in our reports is this wild dog scenario, where you have a coming together of the broader opposition to unseat the ANC. That would require quite a lot of level-headed thinking, maintenance of some big egos, and some compromises. So that is by no means a guarantee. The potential is there, obviously. That's one scenario. The other scenario is a more radical scenario, where the ANC in desperation runs into the awaiting arms of the EFF, and the EFF imposes certain conditions in terms of cabinet posts and radical policy agendas.
Yes.
And I guess there's a lot in between there as well. So what are the potential outcomes that you're thinking about, and how might this play out in terms of coalition dynamics?
Well, the ANC, I think, will remain the largest party. Okay, it's going to be clearly the largest party, certainly after the 2024 elections, and probably after the 2029 elections. And so, say the ANC gets 45% of electoral support in 2024. Then it needs just over 50%, call it 6%, to make up a majority. Who will it call upon? So it can call on a variety of smaller parties, and not have to pay the price of going into a deal with the EFF. The Action SA is polling, say, in two polls that were released last week, the SRF and the report poll, excuse me, at 6%. So that could form a coalition. But to say they go below that, that's when real pressure on the party begins. Because if you go into a coalition, you have to give away more than you would. They would give away disproportionately more than their coalition party brings in terms of actual support. So, I think some interesting things begin to happen then, and particularly if you have two or more, or the ANC plus two or more parties in the coalition. Dealing with more coalition parties creates great complexity. So I think in 2024, the ANC will definitely be in a coalition or will rule on its own. Come 2029, I think it's a very different scenario, because by then a lot will have changed. If the ANC is in a coalition, it will have been seen to have been weakened. I don't think delivery will necessarily improve, even with its coalition partners. So let's talk about 2029 as a coalition. And the big question then is, would an opposition coalition take over? Say the DA as from what we know now, the DA potentially as the anchor of this coalition, together with a whole lot of small parties. Then I think things begin to get really interesting. And I think it's going to be very difficult, even for the DA boasts of its coalition expertise in running Cape Town and now in Johannesburg and elsewhere, and in over some 20 municipalities across the country. But it's difficult, and Smaller parties can cause chaos, they can topple you. And so what we might see then is, or possibly even in after 2024, if there is a coalition and the margin of the coalition government is very narrow, what we'll see are possibly more frequent elections. So if the smaller party does not get what it wants and challenges the ANC and believes it can do well in an election, it will withdraw its support. And in those circumstances, there's an acting president that is appointed, who then must call an election within 30 days if a government can't be formed. And so one might have more frequent elections, more campaigning. And I think that'll add an element of great chaos and I think possible frustration for the electorate. But I think that is an inevitable part, perhaps, of a proportional representation system. And remember, we're not very experienced at coalitions, which is the default type government formation in a proportional representation system. The only reason why we've not had coalitions up until now is because we've had a heavily one-party dominant system under the ANC. So I think, we are on the verge of change, and we're building up to it currently. I think one of the crucial factors is where ANC supporters will go. Will they not? Will they just be disillusioned, or where will they go ultimately? And that is a very big question.
Well, I suppose another headwind for the ANC is their ever-increasing reliance on rural voters. But now there's a demographic shift that many people are flooding towards urban areas that tends to change some of their voter preferences. And also when they arrive, they're often met with quite appalling conditions, living on the periphery of the cities in abject poverty. And many of them will be clamoring for jobs. And now you see the labor market is just not able to absorb those people. And what is required there, obviously, is labor market reform. Do you think that the ANC is capable of recognizing that problem and delivering jobs?
I think this is one of the areas in which they're going to hold out, despite the rising cost of unemployment. One of the problems is that if you liberalize the labor market, and that would require taking the price fixing power really out of the hands of the bargaining councils, the industrial bargaining councils, which in effect represent the larger players in an industry, and allowing labor, you can still have a minimum wage, but it need not necessarily be a wage that is fixed by the bargaining council. Instead, it could be related to, say, the wage paid by the government in its public works program, which is far lower. And then perhaps you could get the labor market to clear and more people to be taken up and at least have jobs. But you could, of course, ensure that these are not just poverty-related jobs, and perhaps could be stepping stones and actually help people. I think people would on the whole, prefer to be in employment rather than be excluded from employment because of the price fixed by the bargaining councils. And we should at least give it a try. I know there's enormous opposition to this from the unions who want to retain their power and certain academics, but the government just doesn't have the ability to create jobs indefinitely through its public works program on such a scale. So it really has to be, the private sector has to be given a chance. And this would be one of the big political hurdles for the ANC to jump over. And I just don't see it happening because of the powerful role that the unions play in the party.
Yeah, and in many ways, the unions are in a bit of a bind because they've hitched their wagon to this horse of the ANC. So their criticisms are often quite muted. But then also, as the country deindustrializes, when the economy is shrinking, it means fewer members, fewer union fees. And so their own coffers are drying up. And then also the majority of the COSATU affiliate trade unions are now bureaucrats, civil servants. So their interests are very much aligned with the state and this kind of ever-growing state. So I think that the trade unions, particularly the industrial trade unions, are in quite a pickle themselves.
I think so. And the ANC, is hemorrhaging electoral support because in large part because it can't, service delivery is terrible. And the big, overwhelming issue is unemployment. And the question of how do you address this? And their solution currently is pay more grants and create public jobs. But there's a limit to that.
And what about business, Jonathan? I mean, because in many ways, we're starting to see business coming out of hibernation a little bit. We saw that very high profile clash between Busi Mavuso of Business Leadership South Africa in that Scopa Parliamentary Committee saying that, Eskom shouldn't be blamed for the misgovernance by the ANC. We've seen some chief executives, Fani Titi from Investec and others kind of, complaining, I think Gareth Ackerman as well, complaining about, the poor state of services. But, some of it is kind of a bit timid as far as I can see. Do you think that business will be able to find its voice and push more assertively for growth enhancing market friendly policies?
I think Busi Mavuso is marvelous. Nothing holds her back. She gives credit where credit is due, but she's been fiercely critical and is not scared of anything. She reports to her constituency, which is big business. But I think in certain respects, she is ahead of them in her criticism of the party. Yes, a few months ago, one had in the space of a week, a number of big corporate bosses come out and say, the ANC has to reform. Gareth Ackerman comes out and says, our trucks can't get into certain areas because of the poor state of roads and the risk that they will be hijacked. Then the bosses of Richard Wainwright and Fani Titi at Investec came out and criticized government for not doing enough on general reform and service delivery and so forth. And the bosses at Standard Bank came out with complaining about certain issues. That's a change, and I think a significant change, because government has been very cautious. And now President Ramaphosa wants to sign a social compact with big business, and that would involve big business, labor, government, and community. And there have been delays on this. He wanted to do this some months ago with 100 days. I don't know whether the 100 days are up. But, what is, if a social compact, by definition, would involve trades between the various parties. So business would want reform on some of the big issues which we've discussed. Probably labor market reform ultimately, although big business very often doesn't want labor market reform, but they've probably seen the necessity of this economic growth. But what does government want? But would government give the sort of reforms that business want, making it easier to employ people, getting rid of red tape? I think that those would be, we're not privy to the negotiations, but these would be the sort of issues that might come up. And what is Labour going to give? Are they going to agree to wage moderation or at below the inflation rate or at the inflation rate. What's in it for business if the other parties don't give way? And I would think that the others are not giving way. Yeah, business, what they probably want out of business is a commitment to greater investment. Well, is that good for the shareholders? And big business has to ultimately is ultimately responsible to its shareholders, and is not going to invest as much as it would in circumstances where there's substantial risks that are not being addressed.
And in many respects, the business sector is filling the void left by the retreating state. So if you just look at the mining industry, for example, many of these impoverished communities around the major mines are being supported by the mining companies in terms of social services, etc. There are many private organizations, basically filling those state functions, those traditional state functions. But, I think to your point, we're not going to social compact our way out of this crisis. We need pretty significant trade-offs. And this whole notion of social compacting assumes that you can make everyone happy. But I think there have to be winners and losers in these conversations, and just managing the political fallout of the losers.
I think that's very difficult. And the losers are, the civil service is overstaffed. The public enterprises are way overstaffed. Eskom should probably be a quarter of its size, if not less. And, how do you deal with the political troubles that could occur in the event that there's not some sort of payoff to these people? It's very, very difficult. And but reform is always difficult in these circumstances. And, presently we are politically stuck on the big reforms. And I think, one does need leadership. One has to bite the bullet on certain other things. But that's why, there are two types of reform on the question of, is it best to go for big bang reform, where you do a whole lot of things at once, and it sort of politically overwhelms the system, and your opposition is taken unawares, and it's all just done? Or do you do it gradually, in which case the risks of your reforms being derailed could be greater?
Yeah, and in many ways, we don't have the luxury of time, and we're racing against the ever failing state, as well as, and from the perspective of the ANC, if they want to rescue their political fortunes, they might want to hasten some of these reforms. But as we said earlier, that it seems unlikely that they're going to do that. But I think reform is not like a buffet where you go and just pick the ones that suit you. It's a full 5-course meal, and you have to sign up to the whole reform agenda. You can't just kind of piecemeal your way through it.
And it's also, but if we had extensive reforms in South Africa, addressing the public enterprises, privatizing, taking steps to turning around the energy situation, dealing with the unemployment issues through labor market reform, cutting down the civil service, reducing red tape, and so forth. Well, then, you could stand the chance of turning the economy around in 18 months and creating many jobs. But you've got to have faith in that, and faith that these will be the results. And I don't see the government having faith in that. Will it save them? Is the question they'd be asking themselves.
Right. Well, Jonathan, just as we bring this conversation to a close, this is the Solutions podcast. So I always ask my guests what solutions they would propose. We've had a pretty high-level macro discussion today. But, how would you advise businesses and individuals to kind of navigate through this period of interregnum, where, as Antonio Gramsci said, the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born? How do you steer through these periods of uncertainty?
Yes, you're perfectly correct in saying what you do, and people are going to act on their interests. So I should imagine that there will be increased emigration. I mean, emigration is among the middle classes is increasing. With increased uncertainty, I think more of the middle class will move into townhouse complexes. That's an existing trend, and try and take themselves off the grid to a greater extent, with water and power. And but ultimately, how do you find opportunities for your children? Will you be able to have enough income to survive, to get yourself through these problems? And that is the big issue. But there's no such thing. I don't think when one looks at collapse, I think that even through situations of collapse, one finds people living. Even in Zimbabwe, it's great hardship, but they get through. People are innovative and manage to carry through. There's, in extreme situations, there's barter. Things do continue. In Venezuela, I spoke to a Venezuelan a few years ago, and they said, yes, things are hard, but they managed to get through, and life continues despite these hardships. People find ways to adapt. And one of the serious points of collapse is, what if your country runs out of foreign exchange and can't buy enough imported pharmaceuticals? What do? And that is pretty serious. That's happened in Venezuela. So it's only the rich who can afford perhaps black market pharmaceuticals to save themselves often. But I don't think it's coming to that. We are reserved. We're not. I don't think one can say that there's a great risk of hyperinflation, collapse of our monetary system, and so forth. The Reserve Bank, despite threats to its independence, is maintaining its stance and is solid. And one can take great faith in that, and also great faith that there is a very active and growing opposition. So I don't really think we're there yet. And the Reserve Bank, the opposition, think tanks, business will all save us from that.
Well, Jonathan Katzenellenbogen, I wanted to thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Pleasure. Good to be here.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Also, if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well and share it with your friends or family. My name is David Ansara. This is the Solutions Podcast. Until next time, take care.